Today we're going to go back in time to the late 13th century. There was a gentleman named Rudolph Von Habsburg who ruled as King Rudolph I. He was king of the Romans. And if you've heard the name Habsburg before, you know that the Habsburg ultimately became the most powerful family in Europe, forming what became the Habsburg dynasty or the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburg at one time essentially ruled the vast majority of Europe and were in charge of the Holy Roman Empire. They had lands all over Spain and Italy and Germany and Austria and so many places across Europe. They had huge holdings overseas. And in the late 13th century, the 1200s, Rudolph I was really one of the early patriarchs of the family. He wasn't the founding patriarch, but he was really one of the guys to move the family along in terms of its importance and its eminence within the Holy Roman Empire. He was one of these sort of, they called him the Count Kings. He was a sort of a mid-level management, if you will, within the big machine. And it was through his guise and cleverness that he was able to really advance the wealth and holdings and reputation of the family. And it was subsequent generations of the Habsburgs who were able to assume the mantle and take over the Holy Roman Empire, which essentially became a personal family dynasty. We think of political constructs today as, we have these lines on maps and the nation state is this sort of nebulous thing where citizens are stakeholders and so forth. Back then, these weren't really countries. These were just sort of the personal domains of a single ruler. It was sort of a mafia-type organization, feudalistic in nature. We had a couple of guys at the top, people below them, and other people below them, and so forth. At the end of the totem pole, you get to these little guys at the very bottom who are there just kicking up all of their work and labor and effort and whatever meager wealth they had to the guys higher up the food chain. It was a terrible system, and the Habsburgs were the masters of this in Europe. Rudolph himself was a clever guy. He was also a pretty enlightened guy, and he was in a state, in a position where there was the need for constant warfare, and he hated it. He had promised the Pope he would have to go and lead a crusade. I mean, everybody was warring against everybody, and there was a great quote Rudolph once told a friend. He said, "I wish I could employ more time in reading and could spend some of that money on learned men, which I must throw away on so many illiterate knights." He was very reluctant as a warrior king, very reluctant to go into warfare, didn't want to have anything to do with the Crusades, would have easily preferred to not go into war because he knew the costs. In the same way, so did the founding fathers in the United States. They knew the costs of war. They knew it was something that was something that you never wanted to do. It was too costly economically, costly against trade and commerce. The opportunity cost was high. The life cost was high. The loss of life is never acceptable, let alone to go and kill other people where you make it twice as bad. Not to mention, think of all the better things that we all have to do rather than go and, shoot somebody else in the face. The founding fathers knew this and obviously did everything they could to try and keep the U.S. out of war, particularly in its early days. And that pretty well got away very quickly. War of 1812, the Civil War itself. By the early part of the 20th century, the United States had quickly become the largest economy in the world, in the same way that China's become sort of the largest economy in the world today. Britain was still the world superpower at the turn of the 20th century. But the United States at that point had surpassed them and become the world's largest economy. And they wanted to take that power for a test drive. And so they picked on Spain, and we had the Spanish-American War in 1898. The United States took over all the Spanish colonies. We had colonies in the Caribbean and as far off in Asia and the Philippines. Into World War I, World War II, these were incredible opportunities for the United States to show off all of its wealth and power and status, military prowess. And it became very, very clear at that point that the United States was not only just the world's largest economy, but also the world's preeminent superpower. That became crystal clear at the end of World War II when the United States was able to summarily dictate terms of the new financial system. It became the Bretton Woods Agreement. Everybody else had to peg their currency to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold. And only the United States really had the power and the economic wherewithal to say, you know what, we're just going to unilaterally end this and no longer peg our currency to gold. And everybody else just had to comply because the U.S. has maintained this power with the rest of the world. It started off humbly, just like Rudolph I, humbly. I just love that quote, wishing he could spend some of that money on learned men, which I must throw away on so many illiterate knights. And I think about how many of the agencies, destructive agencies of U.S. governments are sort of modern day equivalents of the illiterate knights who are going around indiscriminately waging war because they think it's a cool thing to do. And I'm not talking about the military necessarily. I'm talking about, people that, have to fondle travelers at airports and, cops that have gone absolutely wild. We're now in the land of the free. If you turn around too quickly to grab your driver's license, that's cause to get shot by a police officer, rampant spying. Not only on the American people, on American allies, on American politicians. This is the definition of government agencies that have too much power, that are abusing their power, that have gone way too overboard, have completely gone wild with this. Excessive regulation, agencies that tell you what you can and cannot put in your body, where they can drag you off to jail because you're not plugged into the grid, because you're collecting your own rainwater. The war on our savings, where you have an unelected central banking elite that conjures trillions of dollars out of thin air and has made it to the point where if you do absolutely nothing with your money, if you take no risk and keep your money in a bank, you will lose. You will lose. You cannot find any place in the land of the free, if you're in a money market account, certificate of deposit, savings, God forbid, a checking account where you earn 10 basis points, 5 basis points, 1 basis point on an inflation-adjusted and tax-adjusted basis, you are losing money. You are losing money. This is a war on savings that they are waging to benefit people that own the vast majority of shares and assets and so forth, so they can see continued all-time highs. And of course, now retail investors saying, hey, I got to get into that game. And people are now surging into stock markets at all-time highs. My friend Tim Price was just quoting some of these statistics the other day. If you read what he wrote on Monday, he was saying that some of this current data shows that investors are now surging in, to the stock market right now at record highs. At record highs. History just doesn't bear that strategy very well. Anytime you get into something at its record high, it's not usually a smart thing to do. But of course, there's no other option. For most people, no mainstream conventional options out there. Because if you do nothing, you lose. If you do something, you take huge risks, and you're probably going to lose. Stocks at all-time highs, bonds at all-time highs. If you loan money to the greatest debtor that's ever existed in the history of the world, you're not going to get a sufficient return to even keep up with inflation. In Europe, interest rates can be even negative. It means you have to pay them rent to loan them money. It's an utterly absurd concept. This is a war on savings. Then you've got, and the thing is, it's global. You've got, the OECD now. This is the rich boys club. It's such a misnomer. They always call the OECD, the rich nations club. These guys are all broke. You've got the U.S. $17.7 trillion in debt. 17 by its own admission, its own balance sheets show that its net worth is negative $17 trillion, and it gets worse every single month. Every time they publish these financial statements, it gets worse and worse. France, Italy, Spain. These guys are all broke, and they call themselves the Rich Boys Club, and they're all sitting around toasting their success in Paris because they've managed to stamp out all financial privacy in the world. Nobody ever looks at it and says, hey, maybe we should change our tax policy. Maybe we should actually try and be more competitive. Maybe we should actually try to incentivize commerce. We should actually try and provide incentives for productive people to set up businesses and create jobs. We should provide incentives for workers to actually work harder and try and achieve and do more. Maybe we should provide incentives actually for economic growth. But no, they don't want to do that. They just want to completely eliminate financial privacy and go and chase people to, widows that inherited the Swiss bank account and chase these people to the ends of the earth and take all their money and threaten them with jail time. And they're toasting this as a success. That's how they define success. In Australia, they've got a couple of adolescent girls have gone and joined up with the IS, and now the police are saying, oh, we got to put a stop to this. They're going and kicking in doors and dragging people out in the streets and arresting folks and all this because a couple of pubescents have gone off and joined a terrorist group, and so now everybody's suspect. Everybody's a criminal, and this is how a free society treats its citizens. This is absolutely insane. What's happening with all this? And I just think of this comment about illiterate knights. We're surrounded by illiterate knights who wage war on our savings and war on our economic freedom and war on our civil liberties. And it's gone absolutely crazy. And I think you just have to look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong is, really one of the freest places in the world. And they said, no, we're just going to put a stop to that. And people are going nuts. And now you've got everybody in the streets, and we've got actually quite a few members of our team that are on the ground in Hong Kong. I've asked them to go around and take pictures. They've sent me some very interesting things. Interesting dichotomy in the way the movement in Hong Kong is being viewed between young and old. And you've probably seen a lot of stories about how polite everybody is. There was that some nice monument and a little sign that says "Keep off the grass." And you've got 50,000 people around there, and not a single one of them is actually going and stepping on the grass, because they're all very respectful, that the grass is there, and they don't want you on the grass. And they put up little signs that say, "We apologize for the inconvenience that we're blocking this road," and so forth. But man, this movement is not going anywhere. They're not taking this laying down. And if you look at this and kind of wonder why, I would point to actually Isaac Newton. One of the greatest scientists that ever lived, one of the greatest intellectual achievers in human history, whose laws of motion in the Newtonian universe still define the way that scientists and engineers approach problems today. I mean, this was game-changing stuff in the 1600s. It still defines our mathematical concepts to this day, centuries later. And Isaac Newton's laws of motion were very simple. The first one was essentially the law of inertia. And he says an object at rest tends to stay at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. This is inertia. This is the tendency for an object at rest to stay at rest. And again, we human beings are objects at rest. This is our natural state, to be at rest, because we resist change. Everybody resists change. It's human nature to resist change. We've talked about this before. Yet change is universal. It's everywhere. It's within us. It's within atoms and molecules. It's within the universe itself. The rotation of celestial bodies and the revolutions around stars, everything, string theory, chaos theory, everything in the universe suggests that change is constant and universal. We resist it. It's in our human nature. It's in our psychology to resist change, but we cannot resist it forever. That's what life is itself, is a constant rate of change. We were born, we grow older, we mature, we become adults, we get older, and eventually we die and we move on to something else in the universe that, might actually be far more interesting. Inertia is an incredibly powerful force, but Newton told us that when acted upon by an external force, and when that external force is sufficient enough, the inertia can and will be overcome. And that's exactly what's happening right now. We talked about it with respect to Scotland, where you had an entire nation of people that overcame their inertia. And I said, that whether they vote yes or no is irrelevant. The amazing thing here is that it's even happening, right? Because what that says is you've got an entire country, an entire nation of people that has overcome its inertia. And for human beings, that's a big deal. And for millions and millions and millions of people to have done this, that's a big deal. And the fact that it even almost happened is an even bigger deal. But now you look at Hong Kong, right? You've got now an entire city-state, one of the wealthiest places in the world, where they have every incentive to just, sit down quietly and go, hey, things are going pretty good here. Let's not rock the boat. And what are they doing? They're rocking the boat because the external force is sufficient enough for everybody in Hong Kong to have overcome their inertia and go out in the streets and say, we're not going to take this. I'm a human being, goddammit. Isaac Newton's second law was what every high school student knows, F equals ma, which actually more appropriately force is equal to the time derivative of linear momentum. But we're going to skip that one for now. His third law, I think, is actually even more important. And Isaac Newton's third law was what's commonly quoted, summarizes saying, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. For every force, there's an equal and opposite force in the opposite direction. Newton said, if you push on a brick, the brick is pushing on you as well. You put your finger on the wall and push. I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm doing this myself. My finger's on the wall. You put your finger on the wall and push, and the wall is pushing back on you. And that's what's happening in Hong Kong. The Chinese government is pushing on the people of Hong Kong, and the people of Hong Kong are pushing back. That's the interesting thing here, is it's creating this environment where people are reaching their breaking points. And people push harder. And that's what history really shows. History shows that people push harder. The French Revolution, people push harder. They took decades and decades and decades of bullcrap by French governments, monarchs, Louis XIV, the 15th, the 16th. They took decades of this. And the monarchs knew it. They said, après moi le déluge. After I'm gone, this whole system's going to fall apart. I can tell. You know, the French financiers were very clear on this. And under the reign of Louis XV, they said, well, we got to cut expenses. We got to do something about this. And then they said, let's look at the budget and figure out what we can cut. I said, well, let's go after these. We have all these public hospitals. We have all these monuments. We have their great works of art and, you know, social welfare. And they said, let's start cutting some of these programs. Let's start with a hospital. I said, no, you can't cut the public hospitals. We're too dependent. Everybody needs the hospitals. And I said, well, let's cut the monuments and the works of art. No, you can't do that. Those are necessities. You know, suddenly all these things that you used to be able to do without, these things that you know, nations never really had before, they were introduced, and suddenly they became a right. You know, they became a right. They became something that people just couldn't live without anymore. The entire system was dependent on the continuance of these institutions that were bankrupting the nation. And the French government knew it, and they said, well, it's just a matter of time. And it happened. And the French people rose up in 1789, and they pushed harder. The Russians pushed harder. Everybody pushes harder. People push harder than governments. This always happens. This is happening now in Hong Kong. And I think it's, you know, this is a very interesting point. To a degree, I think it's a canary in the coal mine moment. Once again, we have a lot of these lately. And I think what this suggests is that this system is really, really on the way out. I'm fairly concerned. There are a number of scenarios that could play out here. Now, you know, we wake up this morning and see that there's supposedly civilians going in and, you know, breaking up these camps and tearing down tents and beating up protesters. You know, suddenly it's no longer the police, right? Now it's these people in civilian uniform. It's some kind of thuggish outlaw types going around, you know, kicking all the protesters' asses. I mean, come on, give me a break. All of a sudden, you know, some civilian group has decided that, you know, they don't like the protesters, you know, that they hate freedom, and they're going to go and beat up the protesters. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, this is something that has, you know, the government's fingerprints all over it. But this is a way that they get to go and exact any tactic they want and get to maintain plausible deniability. You know, this is scary stuff, and it's only going to continue. But the bigger picture here, even again, regardless of what happened in Scotland, regardless of what happens, you know, in Hong Kong, is that this stuff is actually happening. It means that the external force is sufficient to overcome inertia. That means people are overcoming their inertia. We're even starting to see this in the land of the free and all the Ferguson riots and so forth. I mean, this is indicative that people are reaching this activation energy. They're overcoming their inertia now, and they're saying, you know, I'm sick and tired of this. This equal and opposite reaction is something that's even, I think, more important to note, because, again, people push harder. And where we see this in Hong Kong, we saw this all over North Africa, we saw this in Egypt, we saw this in Tunisia. You know, this is stuff that brings down governments. This is game-changing, system-changing stuff, and that's ultimately where this is going. The system has to change. And history shows us this always happens. Key lessons from history. Number one, the world superpower is always changing. There have been so many superpowers going back to the Egyptians and the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Romans and the Ottomans and the Macedonians and the Greeks and the Persians. I mean, there's just dozens and dozens of examples. You know, the Mongols and the Ottomans and the British Empire and the Third Reich and there were so many of these throughout history. They rise, they peak, they decline, and they fall. Lesson 2, the prevailing social contract is always changing. The way that societies organize themselves is always changing. There was we had empires and kingdoms and the feudal system, and then the rise of the nation state, and then, whatever you want to call this state-sponsored, corporate welfare at the expense of the, of the average guy, the benefit of the elite and and the tiny corporate interest at the expense of everyone else masquerading as a representative democracy. That's the system that we have today. It's a complete and total scam. I would argue even dumber than the feudal system, which was one of the dumbest inventions in the history of the world. Even dumber than the feudal system, where everybody else, it's this, this is masquerade of freedom. Everybody pretends to be free. We tell ourselves that we're free, because we get to go to a voting booth and vote between, one illiterate knight and another illiterate knight, and we call that freedom. We get to, democracy, a representative democracy, democratic republics, however you want to phrase it, in today's world just means getting to vote for the illiterate knight that's going to take away your freedom and fleece you and raise your taxes and so forth. I mean, yeah, that's freedom. And then they're going to turn around. They're going to, the revolving door between government and corporations, where you've got, executives in Monsanto who go right into the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Agriculture, and guys at, Exxon and all the big oil companies going to the Department of Energy. And, it just so happens that all the guys in the Treasury Department, come from J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and so forth. I mean, this is not a coincidence. This system is designed for this, where these people just rotate in and out of government right into, cushy jobs at their corporations, or they leave their high-paying executive jobs and go right into government, then hook up all their buddies in corporations. And it's as plain as day. They don't even try and hide it. The arrogance is overwhelming. And they say, not only are we going to do this, we're going to do it right in front of your face, because we know that you're not going to do anything. They think that inertia is so powerful that it's never going to be overcome. And they're wrong. They're so wrong, because the good news here is not only can we push harder, but it's easier for us to push. And we can thank technology for that. This system exists, and that's the thing. The lesson, again, I almost forgot the third lesson, is that the prevailing monetary system is always changing, So we have the world's dominant superpower always changing, the way that societies organize themselves always changing, the monetary system always changing. The Byzantine solidus gave way to the ducat and the florin and the real de ocho and the British pound and the U.S. dollar post Bretton Woods, post Nixon, and it's always changing. And to think that you can just be the dominant superpower indefinitely, and that you can issue the world's dominant reserve currency indefinitely, is foolish and arrogant and just historically inaccurate. Everything that we learn throughout history suggests that these things are always changing, and we're living in a time right now where all three of these are changing at the same time. This system is on the way out. Governments, superpowers go out the door, they decline, and it is primarily debt-driven, economic-driven. When countries go into serious debt that they can no longer service, this is what happened with the French. The Romans were in terminal economic decline. The Ottoman Empire was in terminal economic decline. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was in terminal economic decline. You can look at just about every possible example. Because if you have a strong economy, then you can withstand the invasion, and you can withstand the natural disaster. You can withstand Mount Vesuvius and the famine and all these things. You can withstand those things if you have a strong economy. And if you don't, then the earthquake comes and you crumble and you're finished. And you don't have the wherewithal to rebuild after the famine. If you have a strong economy, then you have excess stocks of food and all these things to help you be resilient. Weak economies don't have these things. And if you have a strong economy, then the monetary system stays present. When the economy is weak, because you're playing games with the currency, you're rapidly devaluing your currency, and the rest of the world looks around and says, "I don't want to accept that anymore." This is what happened in Byzantium. They were issuing the solidus. This was the world's reserve currency for centuries, and they played games with it. They started devaluing it rapidly, and people said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And they stopped using the solidus, and then they came back, and the Byzantine Empire said, "Okay, we learned our lesson. We're not going to do that anymore." And they fixed it again, and they stopped devaluing it, and people started using it again. And they started devaluing it a second time, and the rest of the world said, "Okay, we've seen that movie before. We know how it ends. We're finished." And it was it. It was out. It was out. And they moved over to the ducat and the florin. This always happens whenever countries, whenever the issuer of reserve currency start playing games, devaluing their currency, the rest of the world looks around and says, we need an alternative. That's exactly what's happening today. The U.S. is the world's largest superpower, in decline. Every objective shred of evidence suggests that this is the case. It's happening. The U.S. dollar is the world's dominant reserve currency. It's on its way out. It's happening. Shares of other currencies, the renminbi, obvious example, is increasing at a nearly exponential rate. It's happening. Chinese and Russian and Brazilian governments, so forth, they're setting up their own bank to compete directly with the IMF and the World Bank, going head-to-head against essentially the U.S. dollar institutions. It's happening. It is happening. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens over longer periods of time. And the biggest thing is that these systems, that lesson two, these dominant systems in the way that societies organize themselves, they change oftentimes when there's major game-changing technology that emerges. The Industrial Revolution, great example. How can the feudal system continue to exist, when savvy entrepreneurs and workers can go in and invent machinery that essentially puts entire industries out of business and can create tremendous wealth for themselves without having to get, blessings and inside track with the king? Suddenly, the Industrial Revolution made the feudal system completely and totally irrelevant. The invention of technology made that political system completely irrelevant. Our technology today makes the existing system completely irrelevant. And I'll give you some examples, right? The system today says that, everybody that's, within these, these invisible lines, these lines on the map, everybody that's within that, those borders, it's on this piece of dirt, you have to do everything that we say. Well, guess what? You want to tax me? I can get the hell out. And you can't stop me. I can go somewhere else where you can no longer tax me. You want to confiscate my assets? I can move them abroad. You want to take away my firearms? Guess what, buddy? I can 3D print one. You can't stop me. You want to take away the internet? You want to shut off our communications? Guess what? We can set up a mesh network. That's exactly what they're doing in Hong Kong. They take all their devices together. They create their own internet that can't be controlled by the government. It's decentralized. You want to play games with the currency? You can't control that anymore because we can even set up our own decentralized currency. This is what cryptocurrencies are. We can go and own gold, anti-currencies. You want to close the banks? We can hold assets in the blockchain. These solutions all exist, and every one of these that exists makes the existing system completely irrelevant. Banks are no longer relevant. Governments, as they stand, are no longer relevant. Probably one of the best examples I can give you is, let's say, the prevailing system for international content distribution. Movies, right? The way movies are distributed is actually more on even a 19th century system. When movies came around, particularly talkies, and they were distributed around the world, and they would license international distribution rights, and they'd say, okay, you get the South American rights, you get the Brazilian rights, you get the English rights, and you get the rights to distribute this film in Italy and so forth. And all that stuff is totally irrelevant now. And if you've ever traveled overseas and tried to get on, Netflix or Amazon.com, and all of a sudden it says, I'm sorry, because of your location, we can't deliver this content to you. And of course, that's an easy fix, because what do? You jump on a VPN, you spoof your IP address, and suddenly you're rocking Amazon Prime and Netflix and everything else, just as if you were, in your home country. And it's such an antiquated system. You have to look at that and go, why do they even do that anymore? I mean, who goes to Blockbuster? Is Blockbuster even still in existence? I mean, does anybody actually go and rent movies at the store? I mean, people download this stuff online because it's faster and easier, and yet they still haven't adapted fully to that system because they're still licensing these rights, and we can't step on the licensing rights and so forth. It's such an antiquated system. It has no business in the 21st century. This system of government that they have, where they go around and they try and tax all these corporations. Frankly, it's hilarious, because they're these big corporations, these multinationals, are using their own system against them. It's the governments create these laws, and the corporations all follow these laws. The politicians hate it. They all jump down and say, Google's only, paying 2% tax, and Apple's only paying. You know what? It's your own law. It's your own law. They're following your own law. Your own law has these huge gaping holes you can drive a truck through, and they all jump up and down because these guys aren't paying enough taxes. Well, guess what? You can change the law. You can make it more competitive. And if you change the law for the worse, then the company just gets up and leaves. I mean, this is something that a lot of companies have done. They've got up and they've moved. Halliburton was a great example. I mean, they just got up and left and said, man, we're moving to the Middle East where the tax rates are, oh, by the way, zero. And it was an easy thing for them to do because they had so many operations there. These systems, these laws, this construct, the model of government is so antiquated, and it just doesn't exist. Just like the movie rights model and so forth, it doesn't exist in the 21st century. It shouldn't exist. It's so antiquated. And all the solutions, already exist. I mean, all the technology is already out there that makes government obsolete, that makes banks obsolete, that makes all these things fundamentally obsolete. Where you've got corporations that, even the concept of nationality shouldn't even really exist anymore. We're talking about, these lines on a map, that goes back to the rise of the nation state. Again, in the Habsburg day, in the feudal day, these were really, the lines on the map were really personal domains of individual rulers. And it was really with the Peace of Westphalia that they started to say, okay, we'll have the rise of the nation state. We'll start to carve out these lines, and the lines become more permanent, and they'll belong to the people, and all these sorts of things. And then we actually had clear countries and say this is the national boundary and so forth. Well, what's the point? What's the point of saying I'm born on a piece of dirt, so I have this document, this passport that that identifies me as an individual person. I mean, how is that even relevant in the 21st century, where the world has gotten completely flat and digital infrastructure completely breaks down any barrier? We can reach out and touch somebody across the world, regardless of boundaries and customs officials and passports and so forth. It's not even really a relevant construct anymore. Corporations exist outside of that. They're supranational in their architecture. I mean, Google doesn't really exist and there's no national boundary that is remotely significant to Google whatsoever. And really, I think the same concept really applies for individuals. All these systems, all these technologies exist, which puts the prevailing, the status quo, out of business. It's totally irrelevant. Which means that when we push back, when people push harder against their governments, Newton's third law, we have all the tools and all the resources. They got the guns, they're out, buying hazmat suits now and hollow point rounds and all these sorts of things, but their bullets don't mean anything if people aren't there. Their ability to take over the banking system is irrelevant when people don't have their assets in the banking system, or when assets even move into the blockchain. All their power becomes completely irrelevant. And we have all the power because the technology is actually already there. And it's an exciting thing, honestly. I often think about Sir Edward Grey, who had one of the best quotes of all of World War I. He said it in early August, a century ago in 1914. Sir Edward Grey was the British Foreign Secretary. He said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." And he knew it. He saw what was happening in Europe. He knew there was going to be a war of absolutely heinous proportions. And he was right. And it was one of the worst wars ever waged. The confluence of sort of 19th century constructs meets 20th century destructive technology, where you've got people that are still cavalry on horseback with plumes and sabers, as if they were still going to war in the Napoleonic era, going up against mustard gas attacks. I mean, those two things just don't go together. And the chaos and the destruction, the massive advances they had made in artillery technology that just caused so much death and destruction. And he knew it. And he looked at this and he said, this is going to be a problem that's going to last for years, for decades. And he was right, because when Europe went to war, it caused so much chaos and so much destruction for years. And even when it ended and they signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1980, they had armistice and they signed the Treaty of Versailles and everything finally went, became peaceful again. Everything was ravaged. Belgium had completely destroyed itself to fend off the Germans. I mean, to the point that they were practically sowing salt into their lands just to keep the Germans away. And Germany was in complete disrepair, caused hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic. And if none of that had happened, then Hitler would have been a nobody. He would have been some obscure Austrian masquerading as a German, whose highest rank in life would have been that of a corporal. And nobody would have ever heard of this guy, but it hadn't been for World War I, and there wouldn't have been all these consequences and repercussions and hyperinflation and pain and suffering, and this guy wouldn't have ever had the means and the conditions to rise to power, which created World War II, which created the atomic age and dropping atomic weapons on people. I mean, all this happened because of World War I, which happened because of all these competing interests. The Russians were rising and surging, the United States was rising and surging, and Germany was rising and surging. Bear in mind, Germany as a nation by 1914 was still only a couple of decades old. I mean, it was something that came out of the Prussians, and a bunch of these sort of Germanic states and kingdoms just got together and created a nation out of thin air just a couple of decades before. And they said, now Germany exists, and they signed some papers. And they created they created a country, and practically overnight it was one of the largest countries, the most powerful economies in Europe, and that was something that was very scary to the Brits and to the French. And here come the Russians, and you had all these superpowers colliding, and it played out in World War I, and it continued in World War II. For decades and decades, the world was in this state, and Sir Edward Grey said the lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. And I look at what's happening today, and I see cops kicking in doors in Australia and brazen, arrogant spying in the U.S. government, and cops just going out and shooting people with impunity. You see these cases, and they go and they shoot people and they beat people, and we have to have an investigation, and then if it goes to court, and the guys get off, and politicians close ranks around in front of the police, and they protect them because it's a two-way street. Of course, the cops protect the politicians. Everybody thinks that the cops are there for your benefit. You're kidding yourself, man. The cops are there to protect to protect the politicians from you. And if you have any doubt about that, just look what's happening in Hong Kong. Those cops aren't there protecting people in Hong Kong. They're protecting the system. They're protecting the status quo. And again, you look at Hong Kong, look at Australia, look in the United States, you look at the central banking system and the war on savings and throwing people in jail for collecting rainwater. And you look at this, and I say the light of liberty is going out all over the world. But I look at the technology that we have available, and I would submit to you that we shall see it again. We shall see it lit again, and soon. I think it's going to be a very rocky road between now and then. History always shows us that anytime there's a change in any one of those systems, whenever there's a change in the dominant superpower, whenever there's a change in the prevailing social contract, the way that society organizes itself, whenever there's a change in the monetary system, there's always significant upheaval. I mean, even 1971, in the 70s, when they went off the gold standard and Nixon closed the gold window in the 70s, what did they get? They got significant inflation. They got a deep recession. They got, really a crisis. That was just in recent memory. This always happens. There's always turmoil. History shows this almost always happens. Anytime any one of these occurs, one of these changes. That's why I think innately human beings are fundamentally resistant to change. But that external force has overcome the inertia. It's big enough, it's strong enough, it's happening. And we're seeing all three of these happening at the same time. It's going to be a rocky road between now and then. We shall see this light of liberty again. And it's going to happen soon, but it's going to be a rocky road. So be ready. I want to thank you for listening. And I want to talk more about some of these technologies, game-changing, disruptive technologies, probably on our next podcast. So we'll have more for you very soon. Thanks very much.